I'm Erica DiRuggiero, and I'm an associate professor of global health and the director of the Center for Global Health. And I'm delighted to invite you to this latest seminar in a series that the Center for Global Health, together with the Faculty of Nursing and one of our PhD students in social and behavioral health sciences, who also is presenting today, Daniel Eisencraft Klein. We've been organizing a series of talks focused on called Health Inc. And today's seminar is focused on the commercial determinants and Indigenous health disparities. And so delighted to have all of you attend today. And a warm welcome to Amy, who I haven't seen in a while. Thank you so much for making the time. So just to give you a bit of an orientation on how we're going to proceed. So I'm going to briefly introduce the seminar, and then I'll invite Amy and then Daniel, who will offer a response and a reflection to what Amy has shared with us. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers, and I'll come back to help moderate that. So just to start things off, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, First Nation, Anishinaabe, Wendat, Huron, and Haudenosaunee Indigenous peoples, on which the Dalla School of Public Health now stands. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wambat Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And I'd like to also pay our respects to all our ancestors and to our present elders. And I would encourage all of you to also give thought to the land on which you are joining us from, because you may be joining us from a number of different places within and outside of Canada. This fourth seminar is very much focused on huge topics that I think we can't necessarily do justice to in one seminar, but because they're really, these are topics that are intertwined with colonialism and dispossession. And as we know, Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by the commercial determinants of health, which is the core theme of this seminar series. And that poor access to healthy food and environmental degradation and inadequate access to healthcare are among the many issues that Indigenous individuals and communities feel. So Dr. Amy Shawanda and Daniel Eisencraft Klein, who are two speakers today, recently wrote a paper on the topic. And they're actually currently recording a podcast series on how commercial interests negatively impact Indigenous health, which is funded by Defining Moments Canada. So look forward to hearing both of their perspectives. I think just in the interest of time, if it's all right, I know that both of their bios were circulated, so I'm going to invite Amy to kick things off, and then Daniel, and then start thinking about your questions, and please do put them in the chat as they occur to you. So a warm welcome again to Amy and Daniel, and thanks so much for making the time. Over to you.
Thank you, Erica, for that introduction. Ani Kenawea. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I should say it now. Thank you for joining us today. What I want to talk about in this introduction is that Indigenous communities around the globe have faced historical and ongoing injustices, including colonization, marginalization, and forced displacement. These factors have contributed to the social and economic disadvantage experienced by many Indigenous peoples today. At the same time, commercial activities can be exacerbated these challenges and lead further negative impacts on Indigenous health. In this presentation, we'll provide a brief overview in ways which commercial activities can affect Indigenous health, including through the disruption of traditional ways of life, targeted marketing, and co-adaptation of Indigenous imagery, which will also have the potential solution and strategies for promoting Indigenous health and well-being in the face of commercial activities. And we're going to do a small deep dive with two case studies, on one of the commercial tobacco and the other on the infant formula industry. So our main goal today is to make the case that these industry strategies and the legacy of colonization manifest in ways that are intertwined. also the reason why we're talking about this today, because it impacts Indigenous communities today. We see the glamorization, commercialization, decorporatization of things happening in our communities, such as Nestle, such as Pepsi, Coca-Cola, all of these brands that, you know, that Indigenous people are often forced to buy because they don't have, they're often in areas of poverty, so they're unable to come to make better health choices, and that, you know, leads to impacting longer health effects. Change the slide, please, Daniel. So I know we already did the land acknowledgement. I just want to say that University of Toronto is situated on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca and Mississaugas up the credit, but also I'm situated in the Mississaugas of Nogo-Jawanang territory, neighboring Anishinaabe Nation. Sorry, Daniel, you were going to say something?
I was just going to note that we had, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
And then for those, if you're unaware of where you are situated, you can check out native-land.ca. It is a resource to learn about Indigenous territories, languages, land, and ways of life, so that you can further enhance your relationship with Indigenous nations and learn from your local communities in the area. Next slide, please. We would like to gratefully acknowledge the funding and production from Defining Moments. They are a Canadian heritage organization dedicated to commemorating definitional moments in our shared histories through the stories that have made them significant. Our objective is to tell stories largely untold from voices too long unheard. All right, so the social determinants health, at this point, a lot of healthcare workers, those in the healthcare areas would have heard about social determinants of Indigenous health. You know, looking at the root determinants, colonial ideology, governance, social, and oh my gosh, I can't talk. Indigenous self-determination. One of the things looking at all of these is rooted in all of this is the Indian Act. You know, you have the colonialism and this patriarchal legislation imposed on Indigenous people and telling them what they can and cannot do. And this has been enacted since 1876, and it's been really oppressive, and it's still oppressing us today. You know, we can't make a lot of decisions. We went from this colonial structure, we went from a clan structure that was each person had a role in the community, and we often worked with our community members and census-based. And then when we had settlers come in and they were seeing how things were done, they didn't like that. They disrupted our government structures. So they were like, okay, so now we need to just deal with one person, talk to only one person. And so it was the start and the rift of this. Also, when we look at the root determinants, you know, there are other like commercial, like when I think of the colonial ideologies and governance systems, I can't help but think of Hudson's Bay Company and the first interaction. And, you know, the start of Canada really was because of the Hudson's Bay Company. So we have this relationship, and, you know, Anishinaabe people were part of welcoming them into the community. We're happy that they brought tools for us to use. It was much easier for our day-to-day life, but also it came with a cost. We started altering our ways of living, doing, and being. So some of that is still structural and it's still systemic. We went from having our ways of doing, being living in lodges, working together, community-based, and then now we're told, now if you want medicines, you have to come to an HBC post. Now we have healthcare systems that we have to obtain. We are definitely what we can and cannot get from NIHB, which is non-insured health benefits for First Nations people. And that's not even talking about those. Those are specifically people with status, and those that don't have status or Métis often don't get the same inclusion of rates as First Nations or the NIHB. So that definitely impacts. So we're looking at community infrastructures, resources, and capacities. Environmental stewardship is also impacted. We're also making this beautiful shift to cultural resurgence. I see it happening in front lines, grassroots, on many different levels of Indigenous people taking back what what was theirs and really reclaiming it in the 21st century. And so there is this core element of we are in these structures, in these spaces, being oppressed, but we're finding ways around it. I was just at the hospital a couple of weeks ago, and I went and lit sage in the room, in the spiritual room. I got in trouble for that, but I was like, it's my human right. It's my human right to pray. And they were like, well, maybe next time you can go outside. I'm like, is there shelter outside for me to pray? And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, well, that's a human right. So I do know my rights, and you need to provide that for me. So being aware of what your rights are too also play a role in this. Not everybody also has their voice, but I am fortunate. I try to use that and propel our agendas so that we are in that resurgent phase. The STEM determinants also looking at health activities in our communities. We don't get a lot of funding. Some places, a lot of kids in the winter will turn to ice hockey. They're playing hockey right now at Little NHL down in Mississauga. That is often a sport because we have winter 6 months out of the year. Basketball, often that's something relatively easy we can do. And there's very limited sports that we can do to encourage our health. We have employment and income, which is very limited on the reserves and what we can have in those communities, what we can produce, how much people we can employ, because often we need them to have education to do that. And then another part of coming back to the colonial ideologies and systems of oppression, a lot of First Nations people have to leave the reserve in order to go to school. So we're talking about James Bay Coast individuals having to come down to southern areas to go to school and be able to get that education and bring it back. And food insecurity is really huge in the North. They don't even water. They don't have access to clean drinking water. The prices of food is expensive up there. And, it's expensive now here in the city, but just imagine how much more worse it got up there. And there are families that, because they're unable to obtain employment, there's also the individuals living on Ontario Works Assistance, which is quite common because, there's lacking infrastructure. There's a lot of things we can and cannot do because of the Indian Act. I'm going to move on because we're going to jump into that more later. So again, just looking at this kind of from an individual perspective, from children, we've got to be our advocates, parents. There's a whole structure happening here in families and in our communities. So if you're looking, children or young adults such as 13 and 14 can start working, and then making sure that they are aware. I try to encourage my own family members, we should be eating healthy and we should be going for walks, or, because walks are relatively cheap to do. It doesn't cost you anything but maybe a pair of running shoes. And so I know that's even a privilege in itself in many communities, because we often don't have the funding resources for that. So looking at individual lifestyle factors, being aware, I really will explain all of this further into, but when you look at the social and community networks, everything's intertwined, everything plays. When you're in a community where there's no drinking water, or, the conversations in and around, for example, tobacco use or cannabis use. We're just talking about this, Daniel and I, yesterday, about having cannabis popping up in a lot of the First Nations, and that's where a lot of the income is coming from for these First Nations. But what if you're pregnant and you're in smoking cannabis? How does that impact your unborn baby if you're pregnant? And what are the long-term effects of that? We don't have the data for that as of yet, I don't believe. And what is that going to look like? It took us a while to get the FASD reports and really educate our members in our communities that this is a real impact, and this is what's going to come from if you drink alcohol during pregnancy. But I really want to get into that more, so let's move on. So I recently just wrote something on bringing Indigenous health knowledge into Western care. Treaty 6 was probably one of the most foundational of them all. Treaty 6 was the medicine chest clause that held, although all of the treaties did negotiate and said, we want you to take care of us, Treaty 6 was the one that wanted it in there. And there's actually 2 clauses within Treaty 6. And so it was, if Indigenous peoples were to be overtaken by pestilence or famine, the Queen, or I guess the government, the federal government, had to, provide assistance and make sure that we were in good health. And so that we had that relief, we were getting the medications, we had the food, there was the past system that restrained us from leaving our communities. We had so many other things happening in our communities where you weren't allowed to, we were segregated into reserves and we weren't allowed to go beyond that. So we lost our hunting grounds, we lost where we would gather foods, we lost a lot of really good rich land where we would harvest food from. And so when we were segregated like that, we didn't ask, first and foremost, there is a stereotype that we asked to be put in these places. No, we did not. We were forced into these, and then we were given the pass system about when we can and cannot go. And then we had to get approval from Indian agents whether or not we can leave. A lot of people would just leave naturally because they were like, well, we're following the deer. I'm not going to get a pass system to follow the deer. I'm sure there was harms that came along with that. So Treaty 6 was very foundational to our rights in healthcare and making sure that that is where NIHB has come from and where we're getting access to some of the health benefits. However, that has been scaled back significantly within the past probably 10 years. We're losing more and more and more of those, even though Treaty 6 guarantees that for the rest of us. Next slide, please. So the commercial determinants health, what is that? Why are we here? So it is a corporate determinant of health that are conditions, actions, and emissions by corporate factors that negatively affect health. So the company choices, oh, hold on, I'm not there yet. Company choices in the production, price setting, and aggressive marketing of products such as ultra-processed food, tobacco, sugar-sweetened beverages, and alcohol that lead to non-communicable diseases such as hypertension, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. So young people are especially at risk because they're influenced by the advertisement and the celebrity promotion on materials. For example, we have fast food advertising to young athletes, highly sensitive, and still developing pathways to teen brains. So you have children like so impressionable at such a young age, and they see like their favorite athletes, they see their favorite singer promoting these certain products, and they're like, well, I need to do that in order to be like them. So we have a lot of these glamorization of products happening. We also have mass removal of trees that creates mosquito breeding sites, causing vector-borne disease outbreak like malaria, with up to 20% of malaria risk deforestation hotspots attributable to the international trade of deforestation implicated export commodities. We have that going on in many communities, often looking to logging companies to come and take our resources. It's all about, at this point, extraction. We have a lot of extraction happening within communities from logging, fracking, mining of variable resources. These also create unsafe, toxic workplaces that can impact employee mental health as well. Now I can switch it. All right, so here we have corporate strategies favorable to policy environments. And the reason there is lobbying, advocacy group, sponsorship, manufacturing of doubt, threats of litigation, conflicts of interest, campaign donation. So some of the things that I often think about when I can't help but think of Coca-Cola. I was down in Mexico visiting the indigenous populations there. And one of the things I saw was, it was $1 for, back then it was $1 for a bottle of Coke, and it was $3 for a bottle of water. And so I asked, I'm like, why is it so much cheaper to drink this bottle of Coke than it is water? Water is free, you just plastic it up and you bring it in. And they said, well, that's the point. They want to sell, they want to get you addicted to the sugar. They want you to continuously buy their products. And then often when you have a pop, you want to have a bag of chips. And then, or if you're having fast food and then they're going to pair it with, then you start making these associations like, oh, well, I'm having fast food, then I'm going to have a pop with it. So then you're not making the best health choices in some of these places. And then you see campaigns. If you're in Toronto at Yonge Square, you see all of the advertisements happening. And we have these, it happens in so many areas. Like I'm thinking of even the child welfare policies I'm working on. And I could see as a mother, how if my children are not dressed as the best and the best of the best clothes, there is this fear that they're going to come apprehend my children, because it is this manufacturing of doubt as well. It's like, oh my God, if they're not wearing the best name brand clothing, I'm going to like freak out here, because what if they don't think I'm a good mom because I didn't buy this? And so, there's all of these areas that just play into the corporate determinants. You can change it. Thank you. So I want to talk about, I just briefly talk about this. I
should say, yeah.
Yeah, bridging the two research focus book. Me and Daniel came together from two different perspectives. I'm going to let Daniel talk about his in a minute, but I just want to talk about mine from Anishinaabe. I'm Odawa. I am from Wikwemkong unceded territory. That meaning we didn't sign any of the treaties. We did originally sign the first treaty that we would be part of the Manitoulin Island. Thereafter, settlers were like, whoa, wait a minute, you guys have really great land, really great water, really great fishing. We want that. So they reintroduced, I'm giving you like the condensed version of everything. And so they were like, hey, we want that. Let's sign this treaty. And our community was like, no, we're not signing this. We're seeing what's happening and unfolding. You told us this is what's happening. So we actually own eastern part of Manitoulin Island. And I actually want to give a shout out to Raven Sinclair, who drew this picture for me in my PhD. And my PhD was surrounded by Anishinaabe motherhood, and I was looking at the tensions, challenges, and strengths of motherhood. And I more wanted to focus, just address the challenges that I already knew that were there, but look at the strengths, because I find a lot of our research are deficit-based, and I want to focus on strength-based research. And so one of the things that kept coming up was like, food and language, and how do we really bring this into the perspective of health, nutrition. And so when I was looking at that, some of my moms were saying, I want to be able to feed my children traditional foods. Well, how do we access that? What does that look like? How can we access that in the 21st century when many of our foods, or even the foods, are faced with pollution, or we can't access certain hunting grounds anymore or gathering places because of the do not trespass signs? And how do we, looking at my own motherhood journey, I was thinking about how all of this plays together. Before I jump into that and share a little bit of that, there was looking at my children and looking at the nutritional journey that I was on. I went into thinking I am doing the best for my child. I was eating a lot of takeout. I wasn't eating the best food. I had no knowledge of nutrition or what that looked like, or exercise for that matter. And then as I had my second and third, I was starting to learn more and more and more what nutrition looked like, exercise, what that was so important. I want to have a long, healthy life for my children. And should they have kids, I want to be there for my grandchildren. So I was really thinking about my health and perspective. And then along this journey, I started to see the health products being pushed at me, as well as the unhealthy food products being pushed. Like, let's jump into that right now. So, for example, here is artwork by Ruby Bryce. She's a Métis artist, and this is what we see. This is what has been glorified in our communities. They're not part of our communities at all. They are no shape and form. However, they've been glamorized and part of cultural icons, I would say. We have Pepsi, it's actually called Pepsi. And so it's really taken a front seat. And, oh, I want a Pepsi when I come over. Like I was just visiting my mom on the weekend. And so Pepsi was there. Everywhere I went, there was Pepsi machines and Pepsi cans. I was like, whoa, this is a lot. And, that leads to chronic diseases. the amount of sugar that is in a Pepsi can, but yet here it is front and center in our community. And then we have things like click or spam, and it's has a complicated history. You know, there were points in time we needed this for survival. So our ancestors, not even that long ago, a few hundred years, were eating this for survival, but it is so much sodium content in it, and it's not good for your long-term health because it impacts your cardiovascular and everything else because of the amount of high sodium in there, hypertension, things like that. Same with the China Lily soy sauce. Again, not probably, I don't think any soy sauce is good, but this one in particular, you'll see it everywhere in First Nations home. And, you know, interestingly enough, tea, this is not our traditional tea. I can go out to Jackson Park here in Peterborough and pick things from the land naturally and have a tea made, but instead this one's caffeinated. Here's this red rose, it's cheap, it has a lot of caffeine, and you can share it. You know, was a staple in my mom's house growing up and in my grandma's home. And so like I see this happening, like, you know, when I go over to visit aunties, cousins, they usually have a box of this and ready to go. Not that I'm like condemning any of this, it's just making people aware of these are not traditional products, but they actually are health harms for us. Before we get into this, I'll let Daniel take over here in a second. I just wanted to share that in, you know, commercial tobacco use has a long history. We have the traditional uses of it. And so it's such a interesting topic, very near and dear to me, because as I learned the use of traditional topic, it's been so close to me. But I'm gonna let Daniel take over because I've been talking for a half hour now. So take it away.
No, all good. Thank you, Amy. We are not, neither Amy nor I are known for being particularly quick. So apologies if this goes slightly over, but we will leave room at the end. Anyway, hello, thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here. Just to take a step back, I think what we're trying to do with this overall presentation is we want to make the case that to understand Indigenous health disparities, the commercial determinants lens is necessary to be in terms of bridging it with the social determinants of health lens. So to contextualize what Amy was speaking about and what I'm about to present on, that's really the case that we're making here, that the two need to be done complementarily, and that to understand these health disparities, we have to be also looking at industry strategies that lead to these health disparities. So we're doing two case studies to speak on this. The first is on tobacco, and then the second one will be on infant formula. For tobacco, tobacco is often considered almost an outdated problem, or one that's largely been solved. And much of that is because in many wealthy communities, that is indeed the case. The rates of smoking in many wealthier communities are quite low. But the recreational abuse and addiction epidemic of tobacco is one of the primary causes of premature death in Indigenous communities. And there's a growing awareness of that disproportionate impact, with Indigenous individuals more than twice as likely to smoke commercial tobacco than the general Canadian population. So the estimates differ. It's been estimated as low as 36 or as high as 60%. But either way, that's clearly a lot more than twice as much than the general Canadian population. We often estimate that somewhere in the range of a third to a half of all people who smoke will die earlier because of their tobacco use. And with over half of all Indigenous people smoking, if you do the easy math there, it means that we likely have more than 1 in 4 Indigenous people dying early because of smoking. A recent paper that's cited at the bottom there by Thurber et al. Estimated that smoking causes half of deaths in older Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults in Australia. So this is an issue for Indigenous communities all over the world. I do some work in tobacco control. I know often people see this and think, okay, we've already, we're tackling this, but it is often the most preventable cause of disease and death in many communities. So we have this social determinants lens. The social determinants of health are also, generally speaking, the social determinants of smoking. most of us are aware of these, that poverty and socioeconomic conditions heavily impact our health, precarious employment, education, etc. These also are all felt inadequately, are all felt disproportionately by Indigenous communities. And then you add the colonization and the loss of cultural traditions around ceremonial tobacco, and that starts to paint a picture of the various burdens Indigenous communities have to take on, and that often end up to higher rates of smoking. I think, though, what we're trying to make the case for is that to contextualize that and to supplement that, we have to add the commercial determinants of health lens. So we have internal documents. The Tobacco Industry Documents Archive has shown internally that companies have and continue to target Indigenous communities. They are aware that they are a group with one of the highest smoking rates in North America, and they are aware that using Indigenous imagery is a way to further target them. So in general, we know that there's lobbying against regulations, there's the general corporate determinant strategies. In addition to that, though, we have this co-opting of equity initiatives and exploiting of Indigenous people through that co-optation. So the industry has regularly used depictions of Indigenous people to promote their products, including using slogans such as Australians answer the peace pipe. And this has come up more and more with e-cigarettes, with vapes as well. So Rothman, Benson, and Hedges, for instance, hosted a harm reduction forum to ostensibly help Indigenous people facing addiction. But as many of us have pointed out, there is a fundamental tension in the tobacco industry hosting an Indigenous health conference. It's important to put in context here, these strategies serve to downplay other strategies with less commercial backing that need to be put in place to help smokers quit. So often you'll see this interest in de-smoking. You may have seen these advertisements that industry is now really interested in helping communities, especially Indigenous communities, quit cigarettes. And their answer is e-cigarettes. And for some people, that may be the solution. But they have no interest in putting funding into the various other solutions, cognitive behavioral therapy, all the different non-commercial backed solutions that we know help people quit. So we can see that this allegedly sincere interest is an interest in profit. But fundamentally, the final point here is one that I think gets missed a lot, and we just want to highlight. This is only happening in the global north. So we know that we can see that companies are promoting harm reduction to Indigenous communities and other communities in the global north, and then targeting Indigenous communities in the global south. In general, in the global south, tobacco control tends to be weaker. And so the tobacco industry has not needed to transition quite as quickly into this harm reduction narrative. So this allegedly sincere interest is only sincere in the global north. In the global south, the exact same companies are still targeting Indigenous communities with standard cigarettes. So we have this concerning pattern here of simultaneously kind of co-opting Indigenous traditions while also disproportionately negatively impacting Indigenous communities. Now, you may be familiar with these images. They're generally, most of these are from a few decades ago, this standard cringy use of Indigenous imagery to sell tobacco. We may not be as aware of it in Canada. In the United States, because in Canada, generally speaking, advertising for tobacco is illegal. In the United States, though, this is just a year ago, this campaign. And this is where a lot of my work around the relationships between language, the way that the product is framed and the narratives we build around a product, and the broader profit-seeking strategies, this is where these relationships are important to understand. So Natural American Spirit, this is from the Santa Fe Tobacco Company. Santa Fe took on this strategy of emphasizing their products as natural and that it provides smokers a spiritual or a sacred connection to the world. And you'll see throughout their marketing from decades ago into contemporarily, the phrase is natural, organic, quote unquote, just tobacco and water, pictures of plants and farms and native imagery, like a thunderbird, and references to being environmentally friendly are consistently used by American Spirit. And we have these great internal documents, I mean, tragic, but great that we have access to them, that poignantly illustrate how this native imagery was a very intentional process. Santa Fe's CEO credited his quote unquote fascination with American Indian culture for inspiring the marketing concept, and that he wanted to honor tobacco in its natural state. For what it's worth, natural American Spirit cigarettes are not in any way in their natural state of tobacco. There's all types of additives and it has nicotine. But I think when he was referring to that, he probably meant in marketing rather than in product. So the next step of this is really, okay, this is happening, but is that co-optation or is that actually having impacts on the smoking itself? And there has been some good data to show that these have genuine consequences. There was just a survey done last year of Native American and Alaskan Native individuals that indicated that they disproportionately believe that the companies are affiliated with tribes, which they are not, that the brands are healthier, which they are not, that they have less filler, which they don't, and that they somehow are quote unquote more natural, which clearly they are not. Building on this then, we have this, in fact, Native American Spirit cigarettes actually have more nicotine than the average cigarette in the United States and has more fillers. So you have this double burden. On one hand, it's downplayed in terms of what is considered to be the additives or what's considered to be particularly pernicious with tobacco, with cigarettes. And then it actually is worse than your average pack of smokes. So we want to build on this to highlight both the co-optation of language with how that then actually disproportionately impacts the communities themselves. With that said, generally speaking, we try to not end on a note of hope here. So I want to acknowledge there's strong resiliency in lots of communities. These images are examples of counter marketing that are culturally sensitive, but also make clear distinctions between sacred and commercial tobacco. And that brings us to that tree that we had brought out. So this is a redoing of that tree that Amy spoke about, but with tobacco use. So you can see here, there's a lot of the social determinants of health, right? With the roots being, colonialism, colonization, and everything that manifests from that. What we're trying to make the case here for is that you need to add those commercial determinants of health, not in place of, but in tandem with the social determinants of health. And this, for us, is a fuller picture of what leads to commercial tobacco use in Indigenous communities. So you have to look at not only how these happen in isolation, but how they build on each other. So I realize that we have somewhat limited time, but I'm going to move through this quickly. The second case study builds off this series in The Lancet that was just out last month that highlighted the tactics of the formula milk industry. So just for context, we're talking about a $55 billion industry here. This is a massive commercial determinant of health and one that often gets overlooked. We just want to be clear here before I get started, though. Many people choose not to breastfeed or are unable to. Pressure or inability to breastfeed, especially if it's at odds with a mother's wishes, can have really detrimental effects on mental health, and systems should be in place to fully support all mothers in their choices. So we always want to be clear in our distinctions here between what is an industry and a problematic industry and what is any type of stigma that is placed on parents who choose not to breastfeed. So we have all these known health benefits of breastfeeding. Feeding practices for infants and young children have a profound effect on child survival, growth, development. They're more likely to have healthy brain development. It's essential for preventing this triple burden of malnutrition, infectious diseases, and mortality. It also reduces the risk of a range of chronic diseases in later life in both low-income and in high-income countries. The case for breastfeeding is very strong. So we have these recommendations that all healthy infants be exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months and then continue to be breastfed with the addition of complementary foods for up to 2 years and beyond. However, less than 50% of babies worldwide are breastfed according to these recommendations. And even more concerningly, there are disparities between breastfeeding initiation among Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women, and exclusive breastfeeding rates between Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women. So we already have this sense of these determinants of Indigenous breastfeeding, or rates of Indigenous breastfeeding. The residential school experience interfered profoundly with the transfer of traditional knowledge about childbirth and child rearing. Even more acutely, colonization affected family and community structures. So different living arrangements led to a reduced presence of a circle of supportive women. As with in general with Indigenous health, discrimination, racism in healthcare has a negative impact on the quality of care provided to Indigenous people. And then we have just those broader social determinants of health, income, shelter, education, stable ecosystems, which of course impact Indigenous health behaviors, including breastfeeding. But in addition, it's difficult to overstate here the reach and extent of strategies employed by the commercial milk formula industry. So as I noted, they're a $55 billion industry. They spend an estimated $3 billion still per year on marketing. And this marketing is designed to prey on parents' fears and concerns at a very vulnerable time. And it's partially in tandem with that marketing, there's always this strategy in the background to lobby for less regulation and ensure that services supporting breastfeeding are under-resourced. So what they'll often do is take typical infant behaviors such as crying or fussiness and portray them as pathological and frame them as reasons to introduce formula, when in fact these behaviors are common and developmentally appropriate. They'll often claim their products can alleviate discomfort or improve nighttime sleep. And that often can lead to parents and health professionals misinterpreting typical unsettled baby behaviors as signs of milk insufficiency or inadequacy. More generally, the immense economic power is deployed politically, and this is particularly the case with the WHO, which has faced repeated challenges from commercial interests. They have this power to establish binding international treaties, but we've seen the CMF industry consistently lobby WHO staff and member states attempting to weaken the strength and scope of the code's provisions. And just a side note here that this has also been there's been this tendency for infant formula to imply or even say that the formula will make babies smarter, which is completely unsubstantiated, but it's this big piece of infant formula marketing that we've started to see. So you can see here, this young baby on the left has begun to understand Einstein's theory of special relativity, which is relatively advanced for someone of his age. I know everyone's muted, but I hope that got a laugh from someone. One other piece here that I just want to quickly highlight. Digital technologies are increasingly used for marketing of food products throughout the world. So it's the growth in breast milk substitutes sales has eclipsed growth in the global birth rate. And the use of digital platforms is key to this acceleration. Women are exposed to digital marketing in every country where research investigating this issue has been conducted. In some countries, more than 80% of women who reported seeing breast milk substitute advertisements reported having seen them online. Just in general, the extent to which they have been able to effectively push this is incredible. I don't know another way to put it. For me, someone that studies medical marketing and pharmaceutical targeted marketing, I think everyone doing commercial determinants research should be paying attention to digital marketing. It is so sophisticated and well-tailored. So let me give you just one or two examples. What has happened is it's made it easier and possible to identify and target women's most vulnerable moments in real time. So this facilitates instant contact with pregnant women. So when a mother will often search something on Google about problems with latching or problems with breastfeeding, companies pay search engines to have their content appear in search results to people who submit these queries. Content that appears to offer information personally tailored to meet the mother's concerns can be delivered at the very moment a woman seeks information on infant feeding. And often these are not clearly marketing, they are subtle suggestions, one of which is infant formula, but that can be couched in other strategies, so it's not as clearly an advertisement. Another example is this virtual support group. So virtual social spaces are where people come together to get and give information or support. This is very common right now with new mothers trying to find virtual support groups. The industry is increasingly running these, sponsoring these and running these. And in the process, they make this content that's not often recognizable as marketing again, but it takes this form of spontaneous utterance. So it comes off as, often this will be through texting, where within these support groups, there may be a midwife or someone who's helping the mothers. There will be this authentic, quote unquote, independent advice from trusted peers that often refers to infant formula, but again, is not so obvious to come off as something that comes from the company. And in general, this is just a much more effective driver of brand sentiment. So this is a far cry from what many of you may know from Nestle and those other companies that, just put a billboard up there. These are not clearly from the companies, as I've noted, but also they are so perfectly targeted that they're much more efficient in the way that they spend their money. In general, they know who they are targeting. So this is what the Lancet has sort of, they just put this out last month. So this is their cycle of the commercial determinants. So you can see there's this advertising, promotion, the funding, the networks and lobbying, the industry front groups, and then that just becomes this full circle of increasing economic power, which feeds back into that. So if this looks familiar to you, it's because it is. This slide I made is from 2020, and I'd used it to speak about tobacco, alcohol, and ultra-processed foods. This image was just designed earlier this year, from my understanding, and just published last month. But you can clearly see these same tactics are coming up over and over again. So this is what we talk about when we say the same playbook keeps getting used, whether it's social media, the firearm industry, in this case, infant formula. They're doing the same things. So where does this lead us for Indigenous communities? Despite repeated calls for governments to incorporate the code's recommendations into legislation, overall, only 32 countries actually have legal measures that substantially align with this code of marketing breast milk substitutes, but specifically on transparency around marketing. So Canada did approve the code, but legislation remains quite weak. The United States, on the other hand, it's a whole different story. So it's worth noting here quickly that things have changed with the Biden administration, but in 2018, a resolution to encourage breastfeeding was expected to be approved quickly, but then the United States delegation, embracing these interests of infant formula manufacturers, upended the deliberations. They told Ecuador, the sponsor, that if Ecuador refused to drop the resolution, Washington would actually put on punishing trade measures and withdraw crucial military aid. So of course, the Ecuadorian government quickly acquiesced. And then American officials they sought to water down the resolution by removing language that called on government to quote unquote protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. So this was not ultra radical language to be trying, but they still fought it. So long story short, it was actually Russia who was able to successfully get this through, and unsurprisingly, the United States was not willing to threaten Russia over this, and it did pass, but the United States still was able to get language removed that called on the WHO to provide technical support. So as I referred back to, how does this impact Indigenous communities? And this is where I want to leave us in terms of Indigenous disparities in breastfeeding. So what has generally been focused on are these social determinants. Again, I want to build on this to say it's only when we consider that double burden of the commercial determinants and social determinants does that fuller picture emerge. And of particular relevance here, as Cecilia Tamori points out at Johns Hopkins, is that Nestle and other companies effectively leveraged their position as biomedical authorities decades ago to create these new marketing opportunities. So they were really aided by these colonial assumptions of scientific superiority over Indigenous knowledge. And by doing that, successfully wove this scientific apparatus that influenced healthcare providers into these default assumptions about infant feeding. Now, the extent to which these industry's tactics are impacting Indigenous women is not that well known. And that's where Amy and I are hoping to apply for funding to find out how these specifically impact Indigenous communities. But we don't feel it's a significant leap to assume that new mothers in Canada, particularly in underserved communities, are especially susceptible to these strategies that we know are happening in every country. So again, just to not know, oh, Amy, I'm sorry, I should be leaving this to you.
That's okay. We're almost out of time here, so you can.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I think Amy and I have a little extra time if you all do. Like I said, we try not to leave on a low note. So just to say, this program from the Canada Prenatal Nutrition Program was designed to support breastfeeding among vulnerable women. It was extremely successful. It's clear if you took even a fraction of that $3 billion of that marketing budget that went into and put it into breastfeeding programs and supports, things would look radically different. Amy can speak, maybe if she wants to speak on her own experiences, like just having basic, let's say, basic programs of support and some basic medical grade breast pumps, just those types of inexpensive resources can go a long way in changing breastfeeding rates across communities. So I'm really sorry we went so over. We really appreciate you all taking the time to attend and listen to this. We're both pretty passionate about the subject, so we're really excited that we have you all as an audience, and we look forward to your questions and insights.
Thanks so much, Amy and Daniel. And I think you both, through your two presentations, illustrated the complementary opportunity between social determinants of health rooted in Indigenous ways of knowing and the commercial determinants of health. But clearly more research is needed, right, in this area, and how messages that public health puts out there are being cleverly co-opted by industries. So this is your turn. For those of you who can still hang on and continue to participate in this dialogue, any questions, comments, reflections? So Nicole, thank you for kicking things off. So Nicole Robertson asks, what do you see as a way forward to reduce the harms caused by large corporations that place profits over ethics, especially when they may have significant influence over government and policy? And yeah, thank you for raising that, Nicole, because of course we've talked about this in other seminars, right, Daniel, around the creep on governance, right? In decision making and public policy. So Amy, any thoughts on that very, very big question? and Daniel, obviously keep piping.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge, which way forward reduces the harms? I don't know if there is. I think it's strategically, it's going to have to be coming with collaboration with First Nations communities, because they are the voices of that impacts their communities. And there's no cookie cutter solution either, because we are all diverse and unique. First Nations down in Southern Ontario needs are going to vastly different from Northern Ontario and Western to the Eastern. Everybody has different access to resources, and that's not even including the Métis needs as well, or the Inuit people. So again, I think working with respective communities first and foremost is very important, because then you'll get their voices, their input in order to really sure what is the plan, and especially with the profits over ethics. Oh, I mean, everything is about the dollar sign at the end of the day. So I don't know if Daniel, you want to add and speak to that?
Well, yeah, a question, you're asking the question of maybe the whole field. Something that big, probably the answer, a systems question is going to be a systems answer. I think you need everything from local governance, community ownership, all the way up to looking at big, the broader determinants of health. I think this is actually where Amy and I complement each other well. I tend to look at things through a political economy approach, in part from my education, in part from just the way I think. And you need that, but that has to be informed by community and vice versa. I would say if you take the infant formula industry, it is the larger deregulatory systems that lead to this level of influence. So if you're looking at why lobbying is so effective, you also have to look at why lobbying is so permitted. The often very boring policies that are happening where it's the stuff that I love, but often, gets lost in the process, where kind of technical processes of what is permitted, different little language around lobbying, those have huge ramifications for industry, and industry is paying attention. They don't find it boring. They're very interested in making sure those are favorable environments. We do need to pay attention to those, even if they're not always as exciting.
Yeah, very good point. So another question, and maybe I can start with you, Daniel, is what role do you think public health can play in media or influencing marketing literacy education? And certainly, Amy, if you have a perspective on that, please jump in.
Yeah, well, Erica, I think you know much more about this than I do. There's really good work being done at Berkeley Media I think it's called Berkeley's Media Group, Media Studies Group. I think there's an increasing recognition of the need to intertwine fields. So in the case of, in my work, like I've alluded to, political science there's a few political sciences in public health, but often these are fairly siloed. Same thing with working with people in communication studies, in media studies. A lot of them know a lot more than we do, and we can leverage that knowledge. But I think it's tempting often to start from scratch, and this work is being done in other fields, and that has generally been my approach. There's lots of different strategies, but that has been what I've ended up doing, and that's been very effective.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say very briefly that I think the creative use of storytelling, metaphors, even just thinking about the tobacco knowledge. So Daniel, you may remember, Amy as well, that years ago, there was a really powerful ad that actually showed a number of men in boardrooms that actually the government of Canada put out. And the key message was not fear, but it was, these people are taking advantage of you. And even on its own did not necessarily have sufficient persuasion without legislative and other actions, but it was an interesting tactic that came from not public health, but from communication experts, right? And Amy, I'm sure you have lots of examples of stories from community. So I don't know if you want to jump in here. Or I can take one more question if you'd like.
We could probably move on to I could talk forever on that. So
yeah, well, actually, I'd like to have you answer or kick off with the next question from Karen, which is, can cooperative, including Indigenous owned and run enterprises producing healthier products, be referenced as commercial or corporate determinants of health, hopefully having positive health, well-being, and equity impacts going forward? Which I think is a really interesting question because, like many industries, they're very heterogeneous. So we shouldn't necessarily be comparing the Nestle's to local farmers, for example, right? Just in terms of looking at that. Any thoughts on that question from Karen? Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, I feel like we've been doing this for such decades. I feel like there's been a lot of First Nations people trying to enter the market, but we run into like, we can't get enough people to buy. I see it on social media all the time. Well, can I buy that because First Nations? Yes, absolutely. If the First Nations support local, and there is also there is healthier products. We have it's treaties. He makes carbonated water. Oh my God, I know his name. I grew up with him. Oh my gosh. Anyways, it's called Tree Teas, and it's carbonated water, and they're actually Zabi water carbonate. Like, there are healthier options out there, so you can still get the sparkling bubbly water in and still have that effect of carbonation water, as opposed to like a Pepsi. They do cost a little bit more because the manufacturing is quite different. So we are moving into that sphere of healthier foods and nutrition, but also we need everybody to kind of jump on board and buy in, and like, let's really support First Nations so that we can make a difference. Because a lot of these companies, even looking at Cheekbone Beauty, Jennifer is also out there giving back. So a lot of the proceeds are coming back into community, or scholarships are being set up. So like, when we set up our companies, they are often coming back into community. So if you see these products, share them with family and friends. I'm telling you, they're really good because they put a lot of thought and love into the products that they make, so that it supports community at the end of the day.
Thank you.
I would just add, I would just briefly add, we have been very good, commercial determinant scholars have been very good at critiquing and often at pointing out the needs for more regulation. We have not been as successful in suggesting different market models, one of which is Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned. I think Kelly Lee, who will be our speaker next month, has spoken about this, that there is a need not only to critique, which academics are great at, including myself, but suggest alternatives. And that is one area that I think is starting to emerge. The World Health Organization's definition, to your question, of the commercial terms of health includes both positive and negative consequences of the profit incentive. So that can be leveraged. I mean, much of this work is about how powerful the profit incentive is, and that can be used for good or for evil. As Amy refers to, there's lots going on in Indigenous communities. It just doesn't often get broadcast.
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question, Karen, and both of your responses. I think, as you say, we can continue to document what the problems are, but there are acts of resistance and resilience that are coming from communities that need to also be surfaced so they can inspire other movements, right? So I think those are all the questions we have, unless there's a late breaking one. Lots of thank yous in the chat, which I won't have time to summarize. But I just want to perhaps, I think there are no more questions. So let's maybe just take this moment to thank both of our speakers. Amy and Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And really, I think, modeling a collaboration in the way you presented today, and the complementary knowledges that can be brought to bear to address a very thorny, under-researched area of scholarship. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining today, and stay tuned for our next session, which will be promoted by the Center for Global Health and the Faculty of Nursing. So on behalf of Daniel, wearing another hat, Quinn and Crudy and myself, thank you all for joining and for your interest in this topic. And thanks to Daniel again and Amy.
Thank you all. Our podcast will be coming out in the spring or summer, so please look out for it.
There you go. Other infomercial. Thank you.
Shameless.